The gavel hadn't even dropped yet. Silas Crowder was already laughing. Turned in his seat at the Bryan County livestock auction, faced the room full of ranchers and farmers and pointed at the young woman 3 rows back, holding paddle number 12. "Somebody stop her before she embarrasses herself further," he said, loud enough that nobody missed it. His voice carried that particular brand of cruelty that doesn't need to shout. 90 dying sheep and a broke girl from a dead farm. That's not farming. That's a charity case buying a funeral. The room went quiet for exactly 1 second. Then people laughed. Willa Mercer didn't lower her paddle. She didn't look at Silas. She stared straight ahead at those 90 thin, hollow-eyed sheep, and she raised it higher. If you've ever been the person, everyone counted out, "Stay with me." Subscribe to this channel and hit the bell, because the stories we tell here don't end where people expect them to. Drop your city or country in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go back to that auction barn, because what happened next took 2 years to fully understand, and it started with an old man's handwriting in a leather book nobody else bothered to read. The morning Willa Mercer drove to the Bryan County livestock auction, she had $462 left in her checking account, a truck that needed 2 new tires, and approximately 0 people in her corner. That's not a complaint. That's just the honest inventory of where she stood. She'd been back at Briar Ridge for 11 weeks by then. 11 weeks since her grandmother Mabel had fallen on the back porch steps, fracturing her hip in 2 places, and the hospital social worker had called Willa's cell phone with that particular careful voice that means someone needs to come home, and that someone is you. Willa had been in Columbus at the time, working a decent enough logistics job, renting a decent enough apartment, building what she privately called a decent enough life. Which, when she heard Mabel's voice on the phone that same evening, thin and papery, and trying very hard to sound fine, she realized was the problem. Decent enough. She'd been building something comfortable enough to stay in, and not quite worth fighting for. She came home that same weekend, packed 2 bags, gave 30 days' notice on the apartment, and told her boss she needed a leave of absence. He told her that wasn't really how it worked in their department. She told him she understood completely. She cleaned out her desk the following Friday. Briar Ridge was 68 acres of Appalachian Hill country that had never been easy to work and was, in the estimation of most people who'd looked at it over the decades, not worth the effort of trying. Deep pastures, soil that wore out fast, an old tobacco allotment that went fallow before Willa was born, a barn that had shed so many shingles over the years that the remaining ones seemed almost surprised to still be there. And Mabel, 79 years old, recovering from surgery, moving through the farmhouse with a metal walker she called that ridiculous contraption, who would rather crawl to the mailbox than admit she needed anything. What the farm also had, though Willa didn't fully know it yet, was Walter. Walter Mercer had been dead for 6 years. He'd been Mabel's husband and Willa's grandfather, a quiet man who kept to himself in the way that some men do when they're actually paying very close attention to everything around them. He'd worked the ridge for 40-some years without much to show for it in the traditional sense. No great harvests, no prize cattle, no expansions. People in the valley had generally regarded him as a man who was content to leave well enough alone, which, as Willa was beginning to understand, was not the same thing as a man who wasn't thinking. She found the ledger on her 3rd week back, cleaning out the back bedroom that had served as Walter's study. It was in a cedar chest beneath a wool blanket and 2 outdated almanacs wrapped in oilskin cloth, leather-bound, dense with his small, precise handwriting. 40 years of observations about a 68-acre farm, rainfall measurements, soil notes, pasture diagrams, water flow patterns after heavy rain, notations about where certain grasses grew and where they refused to, and dozens of hand-drawn maps of the ridge, marked with annotations and margins too cramped to read without good light. Willa sat on the floor of that back bedroom for 3 hours reading it. She didn't understand everything. She wasn't a farmer. She'd grown up here and then left at 18 and spent the following 6 years becoming someone who managed spreadsheets and shipping routes. But she understood enough. Walter had not simply been maintaining the farm. He had been studying it, quietly, systematically, over decades. And somewhere in the second half of that ledger, the observations began circling a specific area on the north end of the ridge with increasing frequency and a growing intensity that even in handwriting alone was unmistakable. Water rises here from below. Leave it alone until there is a reason to open it. She read that sentence 4 times. Then she closed the ledger and put it on the kitchen table where she could look at it, while she made Mabel's dinner. "Grandma," she said that evening, while Mabel worked slowly through a bowl of vegetable soup, "did Walter ever talk to you about the north end of the ridge? About water?" Mabel was quiet for a moment. "He talked about a lot of things I didn't always follow, but specifically water, underground." Mabel looked at her over the soup bowl. He believed something was down there, said the land was sitting on it like a lid on a jar. She paused. People thought he was being foolish. "What did you think?" "I thought he was the least foolish man I'd ever met," Mabel said. "But I also thought he'd never get to find out whether he was right." She went back to her soup. Maybe that's why he wrote it all down. Willa read the ledger again that night, cover to cover, with a highlighter and a notepad. She wasn't sleeping much anyway. The livestock auction was held on a Tuesday, which meant Willa had driven the 40 minutes to county on 3 hours of sleep and a travel mug of coffee that had gone cold somewhere around mile 20. She hadn't planned to go. She'd driven out to look at a used tractor on the property next door, which turned out to be held together by rust and optimism, and on the way back, she'd passed the auction grounds and seen the livestock transport trailers backed up along the fence line. She almost kept driving. She didn't, and she still couldn't explain why exactly. Maybe it was the ledger. Maybe it was something Walter would have recognized, that particular pull toward a thing you haven't reasoned your way into yet. The sheep were in the last holding pen, separated from the rest of the sale, 90 of them. She counted twice. They were thin in the way that indicates a long process of neglect, rather than a single bad event, the kind of thin that builds over months of wrong feed and overcrowding and no one paying close enough attention. Their wool was overgrown and matted. Several had foot issues visible even from the fence rail. That came from a small operation 2 counties over that had gone under after its owner's death, and no one had put in the management hours to keep them properly in the interim. They were, in the vocabulary of the auction world, a problem lot. Willa stood at the fence for a long time looking at them. She was a big woman, tall and heavy built, the kind of frame that meant people's eyes sometimes landed on her and stayed a beat too long before they moved on. She'd learned to notice when that happened without letting it derail her thinking. Right now, her thinking was entirely on the sheep. She'd been reading about regenerative grazing practices for 2 weeks, not casually, obsessively, the way she approached things that mattered. Walter's ledger had notes about how the ridge's steep pastures had been overworked in the 40s and 50s, stripped by cattle that were too heavy for the terrain. He'd written that what the land needed was something lighter, something that would move and clear without compacting the soil down to nothing. He'd never had the resources to act on it. He'd just written it down. 90 sheep, even thin ones, would need feed and water, and veterinary care and management she didn't entirely know how to provide yet. They would be, objectively, a risk that a person with $462 in her bank account should not take. She went and got a bidding paddle. Silas Crowder was there because Silas Crowder was at every significant agricultural event in Bryan County. That was simply how he operated. He owned roughly 1,400 acres across 3 different properties in the valley, ran a commercial cattle operation that was neither particularly sophisticated nor particularly troubled. Because it didn't need to be, most of its windows were dark and had spent 30 years accumulating the kind of local standing that made people slightly careful about disagreeing with him in public. He was not by nature a cruel man, but he was a man who'd never had to develop the habit of keeping his opinions to himself. And that is a particular kind of character flaw that looks like confidence right up until it doesn't. He noticed Willa before the bidding opened. He knew who she was, knew the Mercer name, knew the ridge, had known Walter in the distant way that neighboring landowners know each other when one of them has 1,400 acres and the other has 60. He'd watched her come back to take care of Mabel and had not given her long odds of making anything of the property. In his private assessment, the farm would likely be listed for sale within 2 years, and he'd have the opportunity to expand his north boundary. When Willa raised her paddle for the sheep lot, He turned to look at her. Then he looked at the sheep. Then he did something that probably felt natural to him in the moment and that he would spend a long time afterward wishing he could take back. He laughed. And then he made sure other people heard him laughing. "Somebody tell that girl those aren't pets," he said. Still facing forward, voice relaxed. "She's not buying a hobby. She's buying 90 problems that are already half dead." A man 2 rows ahead of him chuckled. Then someone else. It rippled through the barn the way laughter does when it has permission. Willa heard every word. The auctioneer didn't pause. The bidding continued, and she won the lot, because no one else wanted it. The price was low enough to be almost embarrassing, which was the only reason she could afford it at all. She signed the paperwork at the side table with hands that were not quite steady. Not because of the laughing she'd been laughed at before, and had developed what she privately considered a fairly solid internal architecture for handling it. Her hands were unsteady because she had just spent the majority of her financial reserves on 96 sheep based on a dead man's handwriting and her own stubborn conviction that he hadn't been wrong. That is a genuinely frightening thing to have done. She wasn't pretending it wasn't. She loaded them over the next 2 hours with borrowed panels and a ramp, and she drove home with the truck cab smelling like lanolin and manure and something she couldn't name that was either hope or catastrophic error. The first week was exactly as hard as logic said it would be. 3 of the sheep died before she'd had them 10 days too, from infections already established before she'd bought them. One that simply seemed to have decided it was finished, lying down one morning and not getting up regardless of what she tried. She called the county extension office twice and drove 40 minutes to the agricultural supply store 3 times in 5 days. She called a vet named Doctor. Patricia Holt, who came out on the second Thursday, looked at the flock with the expression of someone who had seen considerably worse and was choosing not to say so, and helped Willa set up a proper treatment protocol for the remaining animals. "You've got some salvageable ones here," Dr. Holt said, which was not quite encouragement but was not discouragement either. "I need more than salvageable," Willa said. "Most people who buy a problem lot like this one are starting from lower than salvageable, Doctor." Holt told her so. Willa considered that, fair enough. She was sleeping 4 to 5 hours a night. She was climbing the steep north pasture twice a day to check fence lines, because the property's existing fencing was patchwork at best, and twice in the first week she'd found gaps where a coyote had pushed through. She lost 1 lamb to that. She stayed up the 3rd night with a shotgun on the back porch, which accomplished nothing, except confirming that coyotes are smarter about timing than most people give them credit for. Her legs ached in ways that reminded her she had been a logistics coordinator for the past 3 years, Breetsk, and not a person who climbed hills daily. The ridge was not interested in her previous fitness level. It had its own requirements, and she was learning them the hard way, through muscle soreness and shortness of breath, and the particular humiliation of having to stop and rest on a slope she expected to walk straight up. She didn't quit. That's not heroism, that's just the math of a person who has already spent her reserves and has nowhere to retreat to. She couldn't afford to quit, so she adapted. She started planning her routes up the ridge instead of just walking straight at it. She started using the old farm cart for carrying feed instead of hauling bags by hand. She started timing the hardest jobs for morning, when she had the most energy, leaving fence checks for late afternoon. She watched the sheep, watched how they moved, where they chose to go, which ones were beginning to look steadier on their feet. Mabel watched her from the kitchen window and said nothing for 2 weeks. Then one evening she called Willa in from the yard and handed her a cup of coffee and said, without any preamble, "Walter used to say the ridge teaches you on its own schedule, not yours." How long did it take him? About 3 years before he stopped fighting it and started listening. "I don't have 3 years." Mabel smiled slightly. "Nobody ever does. That doesn't change the schedule." The first wool sale happened in March, 6 weeks after the auction. Gideon Pike, a retired shearer who ran a small operation out of a property at the valley's edge, had driven by the ridge twice and finally stopped to knock on the farmhouse door on a Wednesday afternoon. He was in his late 60s, deliberate in his movements, with forearms that told you he'd been doing physical work his entire life. He introduced himself briefly, asked if he could look at the flock, and spent 20 minutes walking the pasture while Willa walked behind him, saying nothing, because it seemed like the right call. Then he stopped and looked at her. Some of this is finer than it looks, he said. The matting's hiding it. You've got maybe 8-10 animals in there with wool worth paying attention to. I bought them as meat stock, Willa said, which was not entirely accurate, but was the easiest explanation. Some of them might be worth more for their wool than their weight. He said it flatly. No drama. Depends on what you do with them. I'm learning what I'm doing with them, she said. He looked at her for a moment with the expression of a man assessing whether a statement is stupidity or honesty. Apparently, he concluded it was honesty. I'll come back in 2 weeks with my equipment, he said. We'll see what's actually there. What was actually there? Once Gideon Pike had worked through the flock with 35 years of experience and a practiced eye, was more than either of them had expected. Not dramatically more, nothing about this was dramatic yet, and Willa was learning to distrust drama and trust increments. But enough. Enough to sell. Enough to breathe a little. She put the money back into feed and fencing and a second-hand water tank for the upper pasture. She reinvested every dollar and told herself she'd sleep better when the math got less tight. She didn't entirely believe it, but she kept going anyway. Elias Boone showed up the following month, which Willa later described as either excellent timing or a very convincing accident. He was 22, from a family that had farmed 3 counties east, and he'd been working seasonal jobs around the valley since his family's operation had run into trouble the previous year. He came by asking if she had any work available, standing at the truck window with his hat in his hands, and the particular posture of someone who has asked this question enough times recently to have most of the optimism worn out of it. She almost said no. She couldn't technically afford to pay him properly. She said yes because she was running on fumes, and she knew it, and because there was something in the way he looked at the sheep in the near pasture, not with contempt, not with curiosity exactly, but with a kind of recognition that he might actually know what he was looking at. He did. He wasn't as experienced as Gideon or as careful as Dr. Holt. Most of its windows were dark. But he was young and willing and quick to learn, and he didn't tell her she was doing things wrong. He asked questions that helped her figure out what she was doing wrong herself, which was considerably more useful. They built a working rhythm over the next 2 months. Not perfect. There were days they got on each other's nerves. Days when Willa made decisions that Elias thought were bad without saying so, until they turned out to be bad. Days when she was too tired to think clearly and relied too heavily on his judgment in areas where she should have pushed harder for her own. But the farm began to run with something closer to a system and less like a controlled emergency. By summer's end, the sheep had cleared 3 overgrown hillside sections that had been impenetrable brush for at least a decade. The grass came back behind them slowly, and not uniformly, but it came back. Willa took photographs every 2 weeks and laid them side by side in a notebook she kept on the kitchen table next to Walter's ledger. She was watching the ridge change, and the ridge, slowly, in the way of old land that has been patient for a long time, was beginning to show her what it had been holding. She noticed the cold stretch of creek on a July afternoon, when the heat had settled heavy over the valley and the sheep had been drifting to the lowest water points all morning. But on the north end, at the edge of the section Walter had marked most carefully in his ledger, a dozen animals had clustered along a short section of creek bed that ran colder than the rest. Noticeably colder. She tested it with her hand and then tested the creek 50 yards south for comparison. Different. Significantly different. She went back to the farmhouse and opened the ledger to the page she'd read first. The one she'd read 4 times that first night. Water rises here from below. Leave it alone until there is a reason to open it. She stood in the kitchen for a long time. The sheep were still down there at that cold patch of creek. She could see them from the window, not moving, not drifting away toward shade or better grazing, just staying, the way animals do when they've found something they need. Willa put the ledger down very carefully. She thought, Walter, you patient, stubborn, careful man. She thought, I think I found your reason. That cold stretch of creek stayed in Willa's mind the way a splinter stays in a finger, small enough to ignore, impossible to actually ignore. She didn't say anything to Elias about it. Not yet. She went back to the ledger that night after supper and spent 2 hours going through Walter's water notations with a magnifying glass and a piece of tracing paper, copying out the maps he'd drawn of the north end. His handwriting was small and cramped in the margins, the kind that develops when a person is economizing paper over decades, and some of the annotations were shorthand she had to decode by context. But the pattern was clear. Walter hadn't marked that stretch of creek once. He'd marked it repeatedly, across different seasons, different years, with small notations about temperature and flow rate and the behavior of livestock in the surrounding area. He'd been watching the same thing she'd just noticed for 40 years. She set down the magnifying glass and rubbed her eyes and thought about what it means to spend 40 years watching something you believe is true and never getting the confirmation. She thought about the kind of patience that required, or maybe it wasn't patience exactly. Maybe it was just faith in your own observations, in the absence of anyone else willing to take them seriously. She understood that feeling in a way she hadn't expected to. The following morning, she drove to the county records office and asked the clerk, a middle-aged woman named Roberta, who seemed mildly suspicious of anyone who came in voluntarily for access to the historical well records for the surrounding township. Roberta produced 3 boxes of documents from a back room, with the air of someone confident they would not be useful, and Willa spent 4 hours at a folding table going through them. What she found wasn't a single clear answer. It was better than that. It was a pattern. Properties to the northwest and southeast of Briar Ridge, properties that shared the same general geological shelf, had both struck water in their deeper wells. Not shallow wells, deep ones, 60, 70, 80 feet down. Properties directly north and south had hit limestone formations at similar depths with mixed results. The county's own agricultural survey from 1987, tucked into the third box, beneath a folder of unrelated irrigation permits, contained a single paragraph about a potential underground water-bearing expansion through the north-central corridor of the township. One paragraph, in a document that was mostly about soil erosion. She photographed it with her phone and sat back in the hard chair and looked at the photograph for a moment. Walter had never seen this survey. She was almost certain of that it was buried in county records in a way that suggested no one had looked at it in years, and Walter wasn't the kind of man to have access to county archive boxes. He'd arrived at the same conclusion through observation alone, through watching his land for 40 years and writing down what he saw. She drove home faster than she should have. She didn't tell Mabel about the survey right away. What she told Mabel that evening over the dinner table, while Mabel ate slowly and watched her with those careful eyes that had always seen more than they let on, was that she'd been looking into the county well records and thought Walter might have been onto something significant. Mabel set her fork. How significant? Significant enough that if it's real, it changes the picture for this property considerably. And if it isn't real, then I've spent some time at the county records office and learned something about the local geology, Willa said, which isn't nothing. Mabel was quiet for a moment. Then she said, Walter talked about drilling for 30 years. Couldn't afford it. Then, when he finally considered it, his health went. She picked her fork back up. Don't wait 30 years. I'm not planning to. I know you're not, Mabel said. That's not what I'm warning you about. Then what are you warning me about? Mabel looked at her steadily. I'm warning you that when you're right about something big, the people who were wrong about you don't get quiet. They get louder. She paused. Be ready for that. Willa thought about Silas Crowder and the auction barn, and the sound of laughter moving through a room like water finding its level. I've had some practice, she said. Mabel almost smiled. More than you know. The second season moved differently than the first. The first season had been survival pure, grinding, expensive survival measured in dead sheep and lost sleep, and money going out faster than it came in. The second season started to have something that felt cautiously like momentum. The flock was 81 animals now, down from 90 after early losses, and one sale she'd made strategically to cover a veterinary bill. Of those 81, roughly 60 were in genuinely good condition, filled out, healthy, producing wool that Gideon Pike had begun actively brokering to 2 small regional mills that were looking for specialty fiber. The remaining 20-some were functional but not exceptional, good enough to graze and breed, but not the standout animals that Gideon got excited about. She'd stopped apologizing for the ones that weren't exceptional. That had been an early habit, this internal accounting of everything that wasn't working, this constant mental list of deficits, and she'd had to train herself out of it the way you train yourself out of any thought pattern that isn't helping you function. The flock was what it was. The land was what it was. Question was what to do with what was actually there, not what to do with what she wished was there. Elias had settled into the rhythm of the farm in a way that surprised her. He wasn't flashy about it. He showed up, did the work, asked the questions that needed asking, and didn't ask the ones that didn't. He'd made some early mistakes, a gate left unlatched, that cost them an afternoon of chasing ship back from the lower road, a miscalculation about feed quantities that put them short for 4 days in February, and he'd owned those mistakes without drama, which was more than she'd expected from a 22-year-old. She'd made her own mistakes in the same period. The difference was she'd been doing it longer than she'd been willing to admit she needed to. In April, Gideon brought 2 buyers out to the farm. He called ahead this time, which she appreciated, and she'd had 48 hours to make sure the property looked like something other than a work in progress. She walked them through the upper pasture with a composure she mostly felt and partly performed, answered their questions about the grazing rotation without using any of the terminology she'd learned 3 weeks earlier and not yet fully absorbed, and sold 14 breeding ewes at a price that made her stand very still in the driveway after their truck pulled away. Elias came and stood next to her. Good? Very good, she said. You're not doing the thing where you smile. I'll smile later. She turned back toward the barn. Right now, I need to figure out what I'm doing with that money. He followed her. More fencing? Some. And I want to talk to a well driller. He was quiet for a moment. Then, is this about the North Creek section? She stopped walking and looked at him. He'd noticed the sheep behavior there, too. She hadn't said anything, but she'd caught him watching them cluster at the cold stretch more than once. He was a farm kid. Farm kids notice things about animals. Yes, she said, it is. That's a big swing, I know. You've got the money for it? Not yet. Getting closer. He nodded slowly, with the expression of someone working through a calculation that doesn't fully resolve. Okay, he said finally. That's it? Just okay? He shrugged. You've been right more often than people gave you credit for. I'm not going to be the next person who counts you out. She looked at him for a moment. Then she turned and went into the barn, because there was work to do, and because standing in driveways having feelings about things was not an efficient use of her morning. Silas Crowder's property bordered Briar Ridge, on the southwestern edge, a long shared fence line that ran down a hollow and back up the other side, following a boundary survey from the 1940s that had been quietly disputed twice and settled both times without resolution. He had 1,400 acres, and she had 68, and the border between them had never needed to matter much because nobody on either side had been pushing against it. That changed in May. She found 3 of his cattle in her lower pasture on a Tuesday morning. The fence line had been pushed down, not broken. Pushed, which means weight, which means the cattle had been leaning on it long enough to take it down gradually. She called the number listed for his operation, reached a ranch hand who said he'd pass the message along. Spent windows were dark, and spent 2 hours repairing the fence herself because the sheep needed that pasture and couldn't use it with 3 Angus standing in the middle of it. Silas called back that afternoon. He was not apologetic exactly. He was the version of apologetic that certain men deploy when they want to register that they consider the inconvenience mutual a kind of preemptive equivalence. Those cattle wander, he said. It happens. The fence was pushed down from your side, Willa said. That's not wandering. That's pressure over time. I'll have someone look at the fence. I already fixed it. There was a pause. Well, good then. Good for you, Willa said. Not particularly good for my morning. She paused. Appreciate it if you put your cattle in the north section until that line is properly checked. Away from the boundary. Another pause. Longer. You're telling me where to put my cattle. I'm asking you to keep them off my property, she said, which is a different thing. He didn't say anything for a moment. When he spoke again, the easy tone had shifted slightly. Not hostile, more like recalibrated. I'll see to the fence line, he said, and hung up. Elias had been near enough to hear her side of the conversation. He waited until she set the phone down. How'd that go? About how I expected. He coming to check the fence? He said he'd see to it. She picked up her work gloves, which means maybe. You want me to check our side again tomorrow? Yes, and take pictures while you do. Elias looked at her. You're thinking about this long. term. I'm thinking about everything long term now, she said. That's what changes when you stop treating a place like a stopgap. Gideon Pike came back in June, not for shearing this time, but for a conversation. He sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee he barely touched and told Willa that one of the mills he'd been working with, a regional operation about 90 miles northeast, had expressed serious interest in a consistent supply arrangement. How consistent, she asked. Enough that they'd want a contract, Gideon said. 2-year commitment, guaranteed purchase at a fixed price. Volume would require you to grow the flock, or at minimum maintain what you've got and improve the quality spread. What's the price, he told her. She kept her face very still and did the math in her head twice. That's higher than what you've been getting me, she said. Because a contract changes the leverage, Gideon said. Mill's not buying on the spot market anymore. They're buying stability. That's worth something to them. And what's it worth to me? Predictability, he said, which in farming is worth more than people think until they don't have it. She looked at the table for a moment. I'd need another year to build the flock to the volume they'd want. I know. That's what I told them. You already told them? I told them you were a serious operation that wasn't at full capacity yet, Gideon said, unruffled. Which is true. You've got time to get there. He finally picked up his coffee. I've been doing this a long time. I know what a serious operation looks like at the early stages and what a wishful one looks like. This is the first kind. She let that sit for a moment. Coming from Gideon Pike, who spoke in measurements and avoided anything that sounded like flattery, it was considerable. I'll need to think about the well, she said, which seemed like a non sequitur, but wasn't. Gideon looked at her steadily. The water thing. You know about it? Walter mentioned it to me once. Years ago. He set his cup down, said the ridge was sitting on something. Didn't say what. He paused. I assumed he meant the land itself. He meant both, Willa said. Gideon considered that. Drilling is expensive. Yes. And uncertain also. Yes. And if you spend the money and it doesn't come in, you're in a difficult position with the contract and the flock both. I know. He looked at her for a long time with that flat assessing expression she'd come to understand was not skepticism but precision. He was calculating something, not doubting her. Finally, he said, Your grandfather was one of the most careful observers I ever knew, and he spent 40 years watching that ridge. He stood up. I'm not in the habit of betting against a careful observer's 40-year conclusion. He picked up his hat. I'll hold the mill off another week while you think. She walked him to his truck. As he was getting in, he said, without turning around, the wool from the north pasture animals is consistently better than the rest of your flock. You notice that? She had. She hadn't said it to anyone because she wasn't sure what it meant. They're grazing different ground, she said. Yes, Gideon said. They are. He pulled the door, closed, and drove down the lane without another word. She stood in the driveway thinking about that for longer than she intended to. Amos Vance was 58 years old and had been drilling water wells in Bryer County and the 3 surrounding counties for the past 31 years. He drove a battered white pickup with his company name on the door in letters that had been faded by suns long enough that they were more suggestion than statement. He came to the farm on a Friday afternoon at Willa's request, walked the north end of the ridge with her for an hour, without saying much, looked at Walter's maps when she spread them on the tailgate of his truck, and then looked at her. You got a county survey, he asked. She handed him a copy of the 1987 document. He read the relevant paragraph twice. Then he folded it and handed it back. This was done by a state contractor who spent 2 days in the area, he said. It's not wrong, but it's not thorough either. What would thorough look like? Thorough would look like what your grandfather was doing for 40 years, Amos said, which is more thorough than most. He looked back at the ridge. I've drilled in this geology before. North of here, 8 miles, I hit a limestone aquifer at 63 feet. Southeast of you, somebody went down to 82 and got very good flow. The formation's not consistent. You can have excellent results or nothing, sometimes 50 yards apart. So you can't promise anything. Can't promise anything in this business, he said. I can tell you the location your grandfather marked is as good a place as I'd pick based on what I'm seeing. Cold Creek is significant. That doesn't happen without movement from below. He paused. But I've had the geology look right and come up empty. It happens. She looked at the ridge. The sheep were up there. some of them clustered near the north fence line out of habit now. The afternoon light was going gold the way it does in late summer over hill country, and the pasture that had been overgrown brush 18 months ago was coming in green and dense, and nothing like it had looked when she'd come home to this place. She said, "What's the worst realistic outcome if you drill and come up empty?" Amos thought about it. "You're out the cost of drilling, which at the depth we'd be going, with the equipment and time involved, is not a small number." He named a figure that was not a small number. She absorbed it. "And best case? Best case. You've got a high-volume artesian source in that limestone that can supply your farm indefinitely, and then some." He looked at her. "And in a county that goes dry in a bad summer, and then some is worth considerably more than the cost of drilling. When can you start?" He looked at her for a moment in the way that people look when they want to make sure a decision is actually a decision and not momentum. "I can be here in 3 weeks," he said. "I've got a job finishing before that." 3 weeks, she said. He nodded and shook her hand and got back in his pickup. She watched him drive out and then stood alone at the north fence line, with the late afternoon moving around her, and the sheep paying her no attention at all, and the ridge just sitting there the way it had been. Sitting for longer than anyone alive could remember. Walter, she thought. 3 weeks. She told Elias the following morning. She told him over coffee before the day's work started, sitting at the kitchen table with the ledger open between them, the way she'd begun doing when something needed to be said clearly. He listened without interrupting, which was something she'd come to rely on about him. When she finished, he sat back and turned his coffee cup in his hands. 3 weeks, he said. Amos has a job before us. 3 weeks. How much of the reserve does this take? Most of it. He was quiet, and if it comes up empty, then we're in a difficult position, she said. But we're operational. The flock is producing. Gideon's contract is still on the table. We'd be behind, not finished. She paused. I don't think it comes up empty. Because of the ledger. Because of the ledger, and the county survey, and the wells north and southeast, and the fact that those sheep have been telling us something about that stretch of creek for 6 months, and I don't think they're wrong. She looked at him. And because Walter spent 40 years watching one piece of ground, and he wasn't a man who watched things without a reason, Elias looked at the ledger. He'd read parts of it by now. She'd shown him the relevant sections weeks ago. He was quiet for a long moment. Okay, he said. You said that before. About the swing, I know. I meant it then, and I mean it now. He looked up. What do you need me to do? Keep everything running exactly as it is, she said. Don't let the flock slip while I'm managing the drilling logistics. And don't tell anyone outside this farm yet. He looked at her. You mean Silas? I mean anyone, but yes, especially Silas. You think he'd interfere? She thought about the cattle on her fence line, the boundary dispute that had never been properly settled. The way Silas had said, I'll see to the fence, and meant this conversation is over. I think he pays attention to what happens on this ridge, she said. And I'd like to know what's under it before he does. Elias nodded slowly. 3 weeks is a long time to keep something quiet in a county this size. I know. She closed the ledger. We'll manage. The 3 weeks were not quiet, though not in the way she'd feared. A restaurant buyer named Dana Cho drove out from the city on a Wednesday. In the second week, she'd been referred to Willa by a farm-to-table distributor who'd apparently been told the lamb coming off Briar Ridge was worth looking at. Dana was of its 35, direct to the point of bluntness, and had the particular energy of someone who had been lied to by enough suppliers that she'd stopped bothering with preliminary politeness. She walked the pasture, asked questions about feed and rotation and processing, looked at Willa's records. Willa had been keeping her own notebooks now, in the same format as Walter's ledger, which she did not consider a coincidence, and then said, Your lamb isn't certified organic. No, Willa said. We're pasture-raised on managed rotation. No hormones, no unnecessary antibiotics. Minimal intervention. Can you document that? I document everything. She handed over the notebook. Dana paged through it with the expression of someone who expected to find problems and was finding fewer than anticipated. This is thorough. The previous owner of this farm believed in careful records, Willa said. I inherited the habit. Dana looked up from the notebook. Are you planning to get certified? Certification takes time and money I'm currently allocating elsewhere, Willa said. What I can offer you right now is full transparency. You can come out here anytime, no notice. and see exactly what we're doing. Dana considered that. That's a bolder offer than certified. It's the one I can actually back up, Willa said. Dana looked at the flock moving slowly across the upper pasture. I want to trial 6 animals, she said. See what my kitchen thinks. If it goes the way I think it will, we talk about a regular arrangement. When do you need them? She could do 6 weeks. She told Dana yes and watched her drive away, and then sat down on the pasture fence for a moment because the day had already been long and it was barely noon. Elias appeared from the direction of the barn. How'd that go? She wants 6 for a trial run. The restaurant buyer. Yes, he was quiet for a second. That's 3 things now. Gideon's mill contract, the restaurant, and the well. I know. 3 big things at once. I know, she said again. That's usually how it works. Nothing happens for a long time, and then everything stays still at once, and you just have to stay standing in the middle of it. He leaned on the fence next to her. You been through this before? No, she says honestly. But Mabel has. And Walter probably did too. She looked at the pasture. I'm trying to learn from people who survived it. Amos pulled his rig through the farm gate on a Tuesday morning, 2 days ahead of schedule, because his job had finished early. Willa had been up since 5. She'd owed its windows. She'd told Elias the night before, and nobody else, and she stood at the north fence line, watching the rig navigate the lane with the feeling that certain moments have of being hinge points, the kind you recognize while you're in them, which is unusual, and which doesn't make them any less frightening. The rig was loud. It was always going to be loud, and there was nothing to be done about that. By afternoon, the sound had carried across the hollow, and she knew, without needing to be told, that people were hearing it. Amos set the drill at the location Walter had marked. He did it methodically, without ceremony, the way experienced people do things they've done hundreds of times. He positioned his equipment, checked his angles, talked to his assistant in the shorthand of people who've worked together for years, and then looked at Willa. Ready? Yes, she said. The drill went down, 20 feet. Soil and clay and the kind of broken rock that told you nothing useful, 40 feet. The sound changed slightly. Amos checked something on his gauge and kept going. 50 feet. Willa was standing 6 feet from the rig with her arms crossed and her jaw tight, and everything she had riding on the limestone formation that may or may not exist at depth beneath 40 years of her grandfather's careful watching. Amos looked at his gauge, then at his assistant, then at the depth marker. He didn't look at Willa. That was the moment she thought, empty. He knows it's empty, and he's figuring out how to tell me. The drill hit something different at 61 feet. The sound changed again lower, with a different quality, like a note-shifting key. Amos straightened. His assistant looked up. At 64 feet, the gauge spiked. At 68, Amos said, without turning around, "We've got something." Willa uncrossed her arms. At 71 feet, the drill broke through fractured limestone, and the pressure changed everything. She heard it before she understood what she was hearing, a different sound, a rushing, insistent sound. And then Amos was stepping back from the rig and saying something to his assistant she couldn't hear over the noise. And then he turned and looked at her with an expression she didn't have a word for immediately. Not surprise exactly. Something quieter than surprise. The face of a man who has done this for 31 years. And still, occasionally, finds what he was looking for. Cold, he said. High pressure. Limestone aquifer. He paused. This is a good one. She didn't say anything. Water was coming up through fractured limestone at 71 feet, cold and clear, and she would learn over the following days, under enough pressure to supply the Mercer farm indefinitely through drought conditions and potentially provide significant surplus capacity beyond that. Walter Mercer had stood on this ground for 40 years and watched it and written it down in a small leather ledger and told no one who would listen. Willa stood at the wellhead with her hands at her sides and the sound of water moving beneath her, and she did not cry. Not right then, not with Amos and his assistant watching. She just stood there and let it be real for a moment before the next thing started. Elias came down from the upper pasture at a run when he heard the change in the drill sound. He stopped 20 feet away, read her face, and then sat down on the grass and put his head back and laughed. Not the way people laugh at something funny, but the way they laugh when something has been too much pressure for too long, and suddenly it isn't. She watched him for a moment. Then she went to go call Mabel. Mabel picked up on the second ring. 71 feet, Willa said. There was a silence on the line that lasted long enough that Willa thought the connection had dropped. Then Mabel said very quietly, "He knew." "He knew," Willa said. Another silence. Willa could hear her grandmother's breathing. She didn't try to fill the silence with anything. Some silences don't need filling. Some silences are their own kind of completion. Eventually, Mabel said, "Come home for dinner." "I'll be there," Willa said. She hung up and stood by the wellhead with the sound of water underneath everything, and the ridge around her in the late afternoon light, and the sheep grazing above her on the hill, without any awareness at all that the ground beneath them had just changed everything. That was fine. That was exactly fine. The ridge had been holding this for a long time. Could share the news slowly. News travels fast in a small county, and in Briar County it travels faster than most, because the roads are few, and the neighbors are close, and everyone who lives within 20 miles of everyone else has at least one reason to know what everyone else is doing. By the following morning, the fact that Willa Mercer had struck water on the north end of Briar Ridge was known at the feed store, the diner on Route 9, and the county extension office, in roughly that order. By afternoon, it had reached Silas Crowder. Willa knew it had reached him because he drove past the farm twice that day. She saw his truck on the road, both times, once going north, once coming back, and both times he slowed near the gate without stopping. She was working the upper pasture when she saw the second pass, and she watched his truck until it disappeared around the hollow bend and then went back to what she'd been doing, because there was nothing to do about Silas Crowder looking at her gate except continue being right about the thing he'd been so certain she was wrong about. Amos spent 2 more days at the property, finishing the well casing and setting the pump equipment. He was thorough and unhurried in a way that Willa appreciated. He didn't cut corners on the casing depth, and he didn't rush the pressure testing, and when she asked questions, he answered them without condescension, which was not universally true of the tradespeople she'd dealt with in the past 18 months. On the last morning, he stood at the wellhead with her and watched the flow gauge and said, "You know what this pressure rating means in a drought year?" "Tell me," she said. "It means while everyone else is watching their wells drop, yours is fed from deep enough that surface conditions barely affect it." He looked at the gauge. "In a bad drought or real one, multi-season this doesn't just keep your farm running. It makes your farm an island." She looked at the gauge herself. The number on it was the same number it had been for 2 days. Steady and unchanged. "An island," she repeated. "The kind people swim toward," Amos said, "when everything else is going dry." He packed his equipment that afternoon and handed her a typed summary of the well specifications and the flow rate data, which she added to the back of Walter's ledger in a sleeve she made from a folded piece of cardstock. It belonged there. It was the completion of something Walter had started. The drought came 6 weeks later. Not immediately and not all at once. Droughts never announce themselves cleanly. They arrive as a sequence of smaller absences. A dry week that extends. A rain system that stalls 2 counties east and dies before reaching the ridge. Another week. Wells beginning to drop their levels by small measurable increments that the farmers who check them write down in notebooks and don't say out loud yet, because saying it makes it real. Willa had been tracking the weather and the well output both, keeping records the way Walter had kept records, which meant writing down everything, whether it seemed important at the time or not. By late August, she had a clear picture of what was happening, and the picture was not complicated. The county was heading into serious dry conditions. The aquifer on Briar Ridge was not affected, and the difference between those two facts was going to matter. The first sign that it mattered to other people came from Harlan Pruitt. Harlan ran a beef operation about 4 miles east. Not a big operation, 60 head, the kind of modest family ranch that stays functional in normal years and becomes precarious in bad ones. He was in his mid-60s, had worked that land since before Willa was born, and had the demeanor of a man who had survived enough bad years to be measured about new ones. He showed up at Briar Ridge on a Wednesday morning without calling ahead, which told her something about where his mind was. She saw his truck and came down from the barn and met him in the yard. Harlan. Willa. He had his hat in his hands, which she'd learned from Elias, was a thing older farm men did when they were uncomfortable about asking for something. "I don't want to take your time. I just wanted to ask directly the well you put in. The one folks have been talking about." "Yes." I've got 32 cattle that are going to be in trouble if we don't get rain in the next 3 weeks. He looked at his hat. My north tank is about a third. My south tank's worse. I've been hauling from the county point up on Route 12, but that line's getting longer every day. She looked at him for a moment. He was not a man who made this kind of visit easily. She could see that in the set of his shoulders, the careful evenness of his voice. How much do you need? She said. He looked up. I wasn't going to ask directly like that. I was going to work up to it. I can see that. How much do you need? Told her. It was a significant volume, not impossible, but significant. She did the math in her head based on Amos's flow rate data, and the storage capacity of the tank Elias had helped her set up at the wellhead after the drill. I can do that, she said. I'm not going to charge you emergency rates. I'm not doing that. He was quiet for a moment. What are you doing? Working it out fairly, she said. Come back tomorrow morning and we'll look at the numbers together. He put his hat back on. Something in his face had shifted, not quite relief, not yet, but the beginning of it. I appreciate you seeing me. You didn't need to feel uncomfortable about coming, she said. I've been watching this farm since before you came back, he said at the gate. I want you to know I didn't think it was going to go the way it has. I should have said that sooner. He paused. I'm saying it now. She nodded. I appreciate it, Harlan. He drove out, and she stood in the yard for a moment and thought about what it costs a person to say they were wrong about something, and how different it felt when someone said it without being forced to. Elias found her at the wellhead that afternoon, running the numbers on her notepad. Harlan Pruitt, he said. It wasn't a question. His cattle are in trouble. He's not the only one. Elias leaned on the fence post. I was at the feed store this morning. Everybody in there was talking about water. Ricky Beaumont's got 2 tanks down to mud. The Garrison place lost their secondary well last week. Willa looked at her notepad. How many operations are we talking about, realistically, that are going to hit critical levels in the next month if the rain doesn't come? In a 10-mile radius? Probably 6 or 7 that I know of off the top of my head. He paused. Maybe more, I don't know. She did more math. The numbers were workable just. The aquifer flow rate was robust enough, and the storage tank capacity they'd built gave them a buffer. But workable and comfortable were not the same thing, and she had her own flock and her own operation to protect first. That wasn't selfishness. That was the arithmetic of actually being able to help anyone. I need to talk to Amos, she said. About expand the storage? About what it would take to set up a controlled access point near the road. Something with a meter and a schedule, so we're not just opening the tap and hoping. Elias was quiet for a second. That's a bigger thing than helping Harlan. Yes. You'd be setting up a watering point for the whole neighborhood. For the ones who need it, she said. On terms that don't drain us dry before fall. He looked at her. Willa, 2 years ago you came back here with $400 and 96 sheep. 462, she said. Right. And now you're talking about being the water source for the valley. He shook his head slowly, not with doubt more, with the expression of someone watching a thing take a shape they hadn't anticipated. That's a big turn. It's not a turn, she said. It's what the ridge was always for. Walter knew it. I'm starting to understand it. She tore the page off her notepad. Call Amos. Tell him I need to talk to him this week. Silas Crowder came to the farm on a Thursday. Not driving past this time. He pulled through the gate and parked in the yard and got out of his truck with his hands in his jacket pockets and walked toward the barn where she was working. Came alone, which mattered. Silas Crowder alone was a different proposition than Silas Crowder in an auction barn with an audience. She heard his truck and came to the barn door and waited. He stopped 10 feet from her. He looked at the yard, the barn, the fence lines, the sheep visible on the upper pasture in the morning light. He took his time doing it, and she let him, because hurrying Silas was not going to produce anything useful. Then he looked at her. I heard about the water, he said. Most people have. He nodded. I heard about Harlan Pruitt coming out. Word gets around. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, my south wells are down 30%. I've got a supplemental tank, but it's not going to last through October if this continues. She waited. He had not said what he was here to say yet. She could see him working toward it, working against whatever in him resisted this kind of conversation, the kind where you show up at someone's gate needing something from them when you've spent years being the kind of man who doesn't need things from anyone. I'm not here to ask for water, he said, which she didn't entirely believe but let stand. Then, what are you here for? He looked at her directly for the first time. I'm here because I owe you a conversation I should have had 2 years ago. He stopped, started again. At the auction. What I said, and said loudly. She kept her face even. I remember it. I imagine you do. He looked past her at the barn. I was wrong. Not just about the water, about what you were doing here. About whether it was going to amount to anything. He brought his eyes back. I don't say that easily. I know you don't, she said. I've been watching you not say it for 2 years. Something crossed his face, not quite amusement, not quite embarrassment. Something in between. Fair, he said. She leaned in the barn doorway with her arms crossed. Not hostile, she'd put the auction barn anger somewhere useful a long time ago. But she wasn't going to fall over herself, making this easy for him either. What happened to the fence line? She said. He blinked. I had it checked. Your side, yes. Your cattle haven't been on my pasture again. She paused. But the survey stake on the southwest corner is gone. I noticed it last week. His jaw tightened slightly. That stake's been an issue since the 40s. Which is why I'm mentioning it now, while we're having a direct conversation, she said. Not as a threat. As a fact that needs to be addressed before anything else between us makes sense. He looked at her. For a long moment, she could see him recalibrating, reassessing what kind of conversation this was and what kind of person he was having it with. I'll have a surveyor out before the end of the month, he said. Good. She uncrossed her arms. You want to see the well? Paused. Yes. She walked him to the north end of the ridge. They walked of its windows were dark. Without much conversation, not uncomfortable silence. Just the silence of two people who haven't established the language for talking to each other yet and are not pretending otherwise. The sheep moved out of their path without hurrying. The morning was clear, and from the north fence line, you could see across the hollow to the ridge opposite, and the valley below still showing green where most of the county was already going brown at the edges. She showed him the wellhead, the gauge Amos's specifications. He read the flow rate number twice. Limestone aquifer, he said. 71 feet. He looked at the gauge. Walter knew. Walter spent 40 years making sure he knew before he said it, she said. He just didn't get to say it while he was alive. Silas was quiet. He put a hand briefly on the wellhead casing, not examining it, just touching it, the way people sometimes touch things that represent something they can't quite articulate. Then he dropped his hand. Your grandfather was a more careful man than people gave him credit for, he said. I include myself in that. I know you do, Wilsa said. He looked at her. I'd like to help with whatever you're setting up. The road access point, I heard you're talking to Vance about it. News really does travel fast. In this county, it does. He was steady now, on ground he understood better, where the conversation was practical. I've got equipment, pipe, fencing, a flat bed. If you're setting up a controlled watering station, that's labor and material you'd otherwise have to source. She studied him for a moment. The offer was real, she could see that. It was also not uncomplicated. Accepting help from Silas Crowder meant entering into a different kind of relationship with him, one where the ledger between them stopped being purely one-sided in her favor and became something more mutual. She wasn't sure yet whether that was something she wanted. But she looked at the gauge, and she thought about Harlan Pruitt's 32 cattle, and she thought about 6 or 7 operations within 10 miles that were heading toward critical water levels. And she thought about what Walter's note had actually said, leave it alone until there is a reason to open it. The reason was standing right here in the shape of an entire county going dry. I'll call Amos today, she said. When I know what's needed, I'll let you know what would actually help. Not a blanket, yes, specific things, specific terms. That's reasonable, Silas said. And the survey stake, she said. Before the end of the month, he said. I'll handle it personally. She nodded. They walked back to his truck in the same workable silence. At the truck, he stopped and looked at the farm, the barn, the house, the flock visible on the hill with an expression she couldn't entirely read, but that seemed, underneath everything, like a man seeing something he'd underestimated so completely that even now, standing in front of the evidence, he was still taking the full measure of it. I called you a charity case, he said quietly. Not to her, exactly. Just out loud. In a room full of people, she said. Yes. He got into his truck. He didn't say anything else. He drove out carefully, watching the lane, and she stood in the yard and watched him go and felt something settle in her chest that wasn't quite satisfaction, too complicated for that, but was something in that general neighborhood. Elias appeared from behind the barn. He'd been close enough to see, though probably not to hear. "Crowder," he said. "He's sending a surveyor for the Southwest stake." Elias stared at her. "He said that?" "Before the end of the month. And he's offering equipment for the road station." Elias was quiet for a long moment. "What did you do to him out at the wellhead?" "I showed him the gauge," she said, "and Walter Specs." She picked up her work gloves from the yard rail. Numbers have a way of making things clear. Mabel had a bad week in the middle of all of it. Her hip was not healing the way it should for her age doctor. Emmett at the county clinic had said as much at her last appointment, diplomatically, in the way doctors speak when they want you to adjust your expectations without quite saying what you're adjusting them toward. She'd had 2 nights of significant pain that kept her up and kept Willa up with her, and on the 3rd morning Willa had called doctor. Emmett's office and spent 45 minutes navigating the phone system before reaching a nurse who told her that they could see the following Tuesday. Willa said that Tuesday wasn't going to work, and she needed to know what to do about the pain management tonight. And the nurse, to her credit, put her through to the doctor directly. She drove Mabel to the clinic that afternoon, sat with her through the examination, listened while Dr. Emmett explained, carefully, that Mabel's recovery was complicated by age-related factors that weren't going to improve quickly, and that required them to think about long-term accommodation rather than full restoration. In the car on the way home, Mabel was quiet for the first 10 minutes. Then she said, "He means I'm not getting back to what I was. He means your hip needs more support than it's been getting," Willa said, "and that we need to think about the house setup." "You're not answering what I said." Willa kept her eyes on the road. "You're 79, she said. "You're not what you were at 60. That's not the clinic's doing." Mabel was quiet again. "Then I want to walk to the pasture gate. This spring. I want to be able to do that." Willa looked at the road. The pasture gate was 200 yards from the back of the house, on flat ground. With the right support, with Willa beside her, possibly. "Possibly. We'll work toward that," she said. It was not a promise exactly, but it was not nothing either. "I know what we'll work toward," Mabel said. "I'm asking what you think." Willa exhaled. "I think you're the most determined person I know, and I think the Ridge has a way of cooperating with determined people." She paused. "So I think you've got a reasonable shot." Mabel looked out the window at the passing county road. "That's not a guarantee." "No," Willa said. "It isn't." "Good," Mabel said. "I don't trust guarantees. Your grandfather never made them either." They drove the rest of the way in a comfortable kind of silence that only exists between honest with each other about something hard. Amos came back out on a Friday and walked the road frontage with Willa and Elias for 2 hours. He was practical about the controlled access point in the way he was practical about everything, not enthusiastic, not discouraging, just looking at the actual problem from the actual angles. "You've got the flow to support it," he said. "What you need is a holding tank at the road end, with a gravity feed from the well, a gate valve on a schedule, and enough fencing to control the access so you're not running an open tap." "How long to set up?" "With equipment already on site? 3 days, maybe 4. He looked at the road. "You'll need to post access hours. You'll need to post access hours. People are going to want to come at 2 in the morning when they're desperate, and you need to be able to say no without it being personal." "I can post hours," Willa said, "and you'll need a simple log. Who came, how much they took. Not to charge people, just so you know what's going out and when." Elias had a notepad. He was writing this down. "Silas said he has pipe," Willa said. Amos nodded. "He'd have what we need. I can work with his equipment." He looked at her. "You want me to call him?" "I'll call him," she said. She called Silas that evening. The conversation was brief and functional. She told him what Amos needed. He confirmed he had it. He said he'd have it at the farm on Monday. He didn't expand the conversation beyond what it needed to be, and neither did she. That was its own kind of progress. Elias had been thinking about something all day, and she could tell by the way he kept almost starting sentences and then stopping. Finally at dinner, Mabel was already in bed, and they were eating at the kitchen table with Walter's ledger on the counter. As always, he said it. "People are going to owe you after this." "That's not why I'm doing it," she said. "I know. I'm not saying that." He moved food around his plate. I'm saying it's when this is over, when the drought breaks, and people's tanks fill back up, and everything goes back to normal. Most of them are going to go back to normal. Back to their own operations, their own concerns. He looked at her. Someone won't forget. Some of them will. And you need to be okay with that second group. She looked at him. He was 22 years old, and he was right. And that was the kind of thing that still surprised her about him, even after months of it. I know, she said. I've thought about that. And I'm doing it because the water is there and the need is there. And if you have both of those things simultaneously and you sit on the first one, you're choosing to watch the second one happen. She picked up her fork. Walter sat on the water because he didn't have a way to use it responsibly. I do so. Okay, you keep saying that because you keep being right in ways that make me realize arguing would be a waste of time. He ate. It's a compliment. It doesn't always feel like one. That's a you problem, he said. And she almost laughed, which was what he'd intended, which she appreciated. The road access point opened on a Wednesday, 10 days after Silas had delivered his pipe and equipment. Amos built it straight and solid. Elias had made a simple sign access hours, the log procedure, a phone number for emergencies. Nothing elaborate. The kind of thing you make when the function matters more than the appearance. The first truck came at 7 in the morning, 2 hours after they opened. It was Ricky Beaumont, with a 200-gallon tank in his flatbed and the look of a man who hadn't slept well in 2 weeks. He filled his tank, signed the log in the handwriting of someone whose hands weren't entirely steady, and stood by his truck for a moment before getting in. I didn't vote for you when you bought those sheep, he said. It wasn't an apology exactly. It was something more honest than an apology. It was a man admitting a calculation he'd made and naming it. I know, she said. How are your cattle doing? Better than they were yesterday, he said. Thanks to you. He got in his truck and drove away. By the end of that first week, 19 different farm operations had used the access point. The log showed 1,200 gallons out. The well gauge showed steady. The holding tank at the road end refilled overnight by gravity feed from the wellhead tank, ready for the next morning. Willa checked the log every evening. She noted the names, the volumes, the times. She wasn't sentimental about it. It was a management record, practical and necessary. But there was something in those names, in that list of people who had been at the auction barn and heard Silas laugh and said nothing, who had been polite to her in public and skeptical in private, who had watched the Mercer farm with the quiet assessment of neighbors, waiting to see whether a thing would fail. There was something in those names that she let herself feel for a moment before she closed the log and set it on the kitchen counter beside Walter's ledger. Not vindication exactly. That was too small a word and too self-centered. More like confirmation. Confirmation that what Walter had spent 40 years watching over and what she had spent 2 years building toward was the kind of thing worth building toward. The kind that doesn't just sustain one family, but spills over into the surrounding landscape and changes what's possible for the people who share it. That was what the ridge had been holding. Not just water. Not just resource. Something closer to what Walter had meant when he'd written, leave it alone until there is a reason to open it, as if he'd always understood that the value wasn't in the water itself, but in what it could do when the moment arrived that required it. The moment had arrived. She'd opened it. She was standing at the kitchen counter, thinking this when Mabel's voice came from the back hallway. Willa. She went to the hallway. Mabel was standing at the far end with her walker, in her robe, at 9 o'clock at night. She was upright and steady, and her eyes were clear. I want to see the log, Mabel said. Willa brought it to her. Mabel sat at the kitchen table and put on her reading glasses and went through it slowly, running her finger down the names. She didn't say anything for a long time. Willa made tea and set a cup beside her, and sat down across the table and waited. Finally, Mabel took off her glasses. Harlan Pruffett, she said. Ricky Beaumont, the Garrisons, the Dobbs family. She looked at the names. I've known these people for 50 years. I know. They watched this farm like it was already gone, Mabel said. Not with bitterness, just accuracy. For years. And now they're coming to it, Willa said. Mabel was quiet. She put her hand flat on the log on the page of names. Walter would have she stopped. Started differently. He would have been very quiet about this, she said. He would have sat here at this table and read these names and not said very much. And then the next morning, he would have gone up to the north pasture and checked The fence line's not said anything about the names at all. Because that's just what you do, Willa said. Because that's just what you do, Mabel agreed. She picked up her tea. Her hands were thin and a little unsteady, but she held the cup firmly enough. Outside, the ridge sat in the dark, and somewhere up on the north end, 72 feet below the limestone shelf that Walter Mercer had spent 4 decades watching with the patience of a man who understood that the land doesn't move on your schedule, cold, clean water pressed upward against the casing of a well that had been worth every dollar and every risk and every moment of doubt it had cost. Mabel drank her tea, and Willa sat across from her in the kitchen where 3 generations of Mercers had sat, and the only sound was the clock on the wall and the distant sound of the sheep on the hill, and neither of them felt the need to say anything more that night, because some things, when they finally land, don't need words added to them to be complete. The drought didn't break in September the way everyone had been hoping it would. September came and went with 3 days of light rain that moistened the surface and evaporated within a week, leaving the ground underneath exactly as dry as it had been, and the county's collective optimism exactly as damaged. October arrived with the same hard blue sky that August had brought, and by the second week it was clear to anyone paying attention that this was not a temporary dry spell that a few good storms would resolve. This was the kind of drought that tests the architecture of a place, not just the wells and the tanks and the feed supplies, but the relationships between people who have to share resources they're all running short of. Willa had been watching the access log carefully. The numbers had grown steadily through September from 19 operations in the first week to 31 by the end of the month. The volume going out had tripled. She'd extended the access hours twice and added a second filling window in the late afternoon, because the morning line was backing up onto the road, and a backed-up line on a county road was the kind of thing that generated complaints to people she didn't want generating complaints to. The well held. The gauge didn't waver. 71 feet down, behind limestone that had been holding water, since before any of these farms existed, the aquifer moved at its own pace and paid no attention to what was happening on the surface. That steadiness was the most important thing she had right now, and she knew it. What she hadn't anticipated, and probably should have, because Elias had tried to tell her something like this 3 weeks earlier, was the way the access point changed the social weight of the farm. It wasn't that people became friendly exactly. It was subtler than that. It was the difference between a neighbor who waves from a truck and a neighbor who parks and gets out. More people were getting out of their trucks now, standing at the access point while their tanks filled, talking to whoever else was there, sometimes walking up to the farmhouse to knock and ask Willa a question about the schedule or the log, or sometimes just not about anything specific. Just standing there in the yard for a moment before getting back in their trucks. She wasn't sure how to handle that at first. She'd spent 2 years being the person people watched with doubt, and shifting into being the person people came toward required a recalibration she hadn't consciously performed yet. She'd catch herself being shorter than necessary. With people, at the access point, not rude, just efficient, the protective efficiency of someone who expects the conversation to go sideways. Then she'd correct for it. It was an ongoing process. Elias noticed. He didn't say anything directly, which was his way of being diplomatically useful. He just started positioning himself near the access point in the mornings, making the early conversation so that Willa could come in when she was ready, when whoever it was had already been established as a person rather than a potential problem. She appreciated this more than she told him, and she suspected he knew it. Harlan Pruitt came back in the 3rd week of October, and this time he didn't come alone. He brought 2 other ranchers with him, Boyd Calloway, who ran a mixed beef and hay operation about 6 miles north, and a woman named June Strickland, who leased 200 acres on the east side of the valley and kept a small herd of registered Angus. Willa saw the 3 trucks pulling in together and came down from the barn with a feeling that was not quite wariness but was adjacent to it. Harlan introduced the other 2 at the access point with the slight formality of a man conducting a meeting he'd arranged. Boyd Calloway was barrel-chested and deliberate in everything, the kind of man who shook hands like he meant it and then waited to see if you did too. June Strickland was in her early 50s and had the direct, assessing eyes of someone who'd been the only woman in a lot of agricultural rooms and had long since stopped making allowances for it. "We wanted to talk to you about the winter," Harlan said. Willa looked at the three of them. "The access point is staying open." "That's not what we wanted to talk about," Junes said. She said it pleasantly, but with no hedging. "We wanted to talk about what happens if the drought holds through winter, which the Extension Service is saying is possible." Boyd looked at the wellhead. "You've got the only reliable water source in this corridor. We all know that." He paused. "What we're trying to figure out is whether you've thought of what that looks like in January if things don't turn around." She had thought about it. She'd been thinking about it every night for the past 3 weeks while she went over the log and the flow rate data and the feed supply numbers for her own flock. She'd been thinking about it and not saying it because saying it out loud made it a plan, and a plan had commitments attached. "What are you proposing?" she said. Harlan looked at the other two briefly. It was a look that said they'd discussed this before coming. A cooperative arrangement. Not complicated. "We contribute labor and material toward expanding your storage capacity on the north end. In return, we get access at guaranteed rates through January, with volume commitments we can plan around." "What labor and what material?" Willa said. "I've got lumber and roofing for a covered storage shed," Boyd said. "June's got a welder and equipment for fabricating a second holding tank." "I've got time," Harlan said. 3 men who aren't doing much right now with their regular work, because the ground's too hard." Willa looked at the wellhead, then at the 3 of them. She was calculating the storage numbers in her head, what a second tank would mean for overnight refill, for the access hours, for the winter scenario they were describing. "I'd need to see specs on the second tank before I agreed to anything," she said. "And the coverage arrangement would need to be in writing. Not because I don't trust you, because I've learned that handshake agreements drift in ways that written ones don't." June nodded. "That's reasonable. And I'm not guaranteeing volume I can't guarantee," Willa continued. "The well is steady, but it's not infinite. If something changes underground, if the aquifer behavior shifts in a hard freeze, I can't promise what isn't mine to promise." "We understand that," Harlan said. "I want that explicitly in the writing, too," she said. "So nobody ends up angry at me in February over something the geology decided." Boyd looked at her for a moment with an expression that was partway between respect and recalibration. "You've gotten careful," he said. "I've gotten accurate," she said. "There's a difference." They worked out the broad strokes, standing at the access point for 40 minutes, and Willa wrote the key points in her notepad because she didn't trust memory for things that mattered. By the time the 3 trucks pulled out, she had a second tank coming, 3 extra hands for the installation, and a winter access agreement that she'd formalize into a simple document that evening. She went back to the barn and found Elias rebedding the lambing pens. He looked up. 3 of them, he said. Cooperative arrangement. Second tank, winter access contract. He set down the pitchfork. "You agreed?" "With conditions." He picked the pitchfork back up. "Good conditions?" "The kind where if it goes wrong I know exactly how and why. Those are the best kind," he said and went back to work. The surveyor came the last week of October. He was a thin, precise man named Gerald who worked for a firm out of the county seat and arrived with equipment Willa didn't know the names of and spent 4 hours on the southwest boundary line without saying much to anyone. Silas had arranged it and was there for the first hour before driving away, and Willa walked the line with Gerald for the afternoon portion because she intended to know exactly what he found. What he found was that the existing fence line was 11 feet east of the actual boundary, which meant 11 feet of Willa's property had been outside her fence and inside Silas's effective usage for an undetermined period. Not a dramatic amount in absolute terms. In terms of what it meant about the history of that boundary, it was something she needed to sit with. Gerald gave her his field notes and told her the formal report would be filed within 2 weeks. She thanked him, and he drove away, and she stood on the boundary for a moment, looking at those 11 feet of ground that had been Mercerland inside someone else's fence. Silas called that evening. "Gerald told me what he found," Silas said. There was something careful in his voice. "He gave me the field notes," Willa said. "I didn't know," Silas said. "I want to say that clearly. The boundary line has been where it's been since before I bought the south section. I inherited that fence position, I believe you," she said. She did, actually. Silas was not a man who would arrange and pay for a survey that revealed something he'd knowingly done wrong. He had that much integrity. "The fence will be moved," he said, "before the ground freezes. I'll cover the full cost." "I know you will," she said. "I'd like to be there when it's done." "Of course." He paused. "Willa, I want to say something else." She waited. "What you've done with that access point, what you're doing for the operations in this corridor, I've been watching it. I've been watching the trucks come and go." He stopped, started again. "I have 1,400 acres, and I've spent 30 years thinking that was what mattered in this valley. The size of what you hold." He was quiet for a moment. "You've got 68 acres, and right now, every operation within 10 miles is dependent on them. That's not size. I don't have the right word for it. Position," Willa said. "Walter used to say that position mattered more than acreage. I found it in his ledger." "He was right," Silas said. "He was about most things, as it turns out." He paused. "I'll see to the fence before the freeze. And I meant what I said about being available if there's more I can do for the station." Told him she'd be in touch. She hung up and sat at the kitchen table for a moment and thought about what it actually takes for a person like Silas Crowder, a man whose certainties are load-bearing, who has built his identity on knowing more than the people around him, to say what he'd just said. Take something being undeniably, provably, publicly true in a way that leaves no room for reinterpretation. She'd provided that. So had Walter 40 years in advance. She opened the ledger and found the page she was thinking of. Walter's handwriting, small and cramped. "Position matters more than acreage. The land that sits at the right point can sustain everything around it, if it's managed for that purpose." She read it twice. Then she closed the ledger and went to make dinner. Mabel had a good week that week, which was not something Willa let herself take for granted anymore. Good weeks happened, and bad weeks happened, and the pattern was not entirely predictable, and the most useful thing she'd learned about caring for Mabel was that trying to predict the pattern caused more anxiety than the uncertainty itself. Better to take the good week as what it was. On the Thursday of that good week, Mabel came to the kitchen table in the morning without the walker. She'd been using a cane for 3 days, which Dr. Emmett had said was possible, but should not be rushed, which was advice Mabel received with the polite acknowledgement she gave to most advice she intended to partially ignore. She sat down carefully, accepting Willa's hand for the last stage of it without making a project of either the needing or the receiving. "I want to talk about the spring," Mabel said. Willa poured her coffee. "Part of spring." "The pasture gate," Mabel said. She wrapped both hands around the coffee mug. "You said we'd work toward it. I want to know what working toward it looks like." Willa sat down. "It looks like what you did this morning. Getting to the table with the cane instead of the walker. Doing it consistently, then expanding the distance." "I know the physical part," Mabel said. "I'm talking about the pasture gate specifically. What I want is to stand at that gate and see the flock." She looked at Willa steadily. "I want to do it before I can't anymore. I'm not being dramatic. I know what my body is doing. I want to do that one thing while it's still possible." Willa held her coffee cup and did not look away. "Then we work toward it every week. Not every day, every week. On the days you're strong enough, we add a little distance. And you'll be with me. Every step." Mabel looked out the kitchen window toward the backyard and the pasture beyond. "Your grandfather walked that gate every morning for 30 years, she said. "Never missed. Rain, cold, whatever." Every morning she looked back at Willa. "I used to think it was stubbornness. Now I think he was checking on something, making sure it was still there." "The ridge," Willa said. "The ridge," Mabel agreed. "And everything he believed about it." She picked up her coffee. "I want to see what he saw before the end." Willa said, "We'll get you there." She meant it. She didn't know for certain it was possible, but she meant it the way you mean a thing you're willing to make true through effort, even though you can't guarantee the outcome. Mabel seemed to understand the distinction. She didn't smile with the relief of someone who'd been given a promise. She nodded with the gravity of someone who'd been given an honest commitment. That was enough. Dana Cho came back in November, 3 weeks after the trial lamb delivery. She came alone this time, without the exploratory formality of the first visit, and that change at manner told Willa something before a word was spoken. She came inside first time she'd been in the farmhouse and sat at the kitchen table with a folder, a straightforwardness that Willa had decided she liked. My kitchen put the lamb through 4 different preparations, Dana said. My head chef wanted to know the source before he'd give a formal opinion. I told him it was a small operation in Bryer County. He said, small operation or not, this is the best pasture lamb we've sourced in 2 years. Willa kept her face level. I'm glad to hear that. He's not easy to impress, Dana said. I wanted you to know that context. She opened the folder. I want to talk about a regular supply arrangement. Volume, frequency, lead time. She looked up and price. I'm not going to waste your time, pretending price isn't part of this. It's the central part, Willa said. What's on the table? Dana named a figure per animals that was significantly above commodity rates, above what Willa had privately considered a best-case scenario for this conversation. She observed it without showing the degree to which it changed her forward planning, because showing that in a price negotiation is the equivalent of showing your cards before the hand is done. I'd need a minimum order commitment from you, Willa said. I can't manage production to your schedule if you're buying opportunistically. I'd want a quarterly commitment from you on volume, Dana countered, with a 2-week lead on each delivery. I can do 8 to 10 animals per quarter on the current flock size, Willa said. Flock grows, that scales. But I won't promise more than I have because I'm not that kind of operation. Dana looked at her. What kind of operation are you? Kind where what I tell you is what's actually true, Willa said. Even when the true thing is a smaller number than you'd like. Dana was quiet for a moment. Then she said, my last supplier told me he could do 30 animals a quarter. He actually did 12, badly, and then went silent. She closed the folder. I'll take 10 done right over 30 done wrong every time. They agreed on terms that afternoon. The paperwork would follow through the distributor Dana worked with, but the essential agreement was made at the kitchen table between 2 women who'd each taken the other's measure and decided the measure was accurate enough to do business on. After Dana left, Willa sat at the table for a moment before getting up. The restaurant contract alongside Gideon's mill arrangement, alongside the cooperative water agreement, alongside the fence survey, alongside Mabel and the pasture gate and the drought and the access log, all of it was in the air simultaneously, and the management of it required a kind of distributed attention she'd had to develop in the past 6 months because she hadn't needed it before. She wasn't always good at it. There were days when one thing claimed too much of her and something else slipped. The weeks she'd been were dark. She'd missed a fence check on the east pasture, and 2 sheep had gotten into the adjacent woodlot and cost her 3 hours she didn't have. The week she'd been managing Mabel's bad days, she'd missed a return call from Gideon, and it had taken 4 days to connect again. She made these windows were dark and tried not to make the same one to them and tried not to make the same one twice, which was the only honest approach because pretending you wouldn't make mistakes was how you stopped being ready for them. Elias helped. He helped more than his job description required and more than she sometimes remembered to acknowledge. She made a point of acknowledging it that evening over the end-of-day check, not with sentiment, which he would have found embarrassing but directly. The lambing pen bedding this week, she said. The feed schedule adjustment on the north group. The morning coverage at the access point. That was all you. He looked up from the pen count. It's the job. It's more than I put in the job when I hired you, she said. Pay needs to reflect that. He looked at her. He had the expression of someone deciding whether to deflect or accept. He chose accept, which was the right call. Okay, he said. I'll work it into the numbers this week, she said. Past due. She picked up her clipboard. And don't argue about it. I wasn't going to. You were thinking about it. He almost smiled. Maybe. The fence line between Briar Ridge and Silas's south section was moved the 2nd week of November, 4 days before the ground froze solid. Silas brought 3 of his own men and a post driver, and Willa was there as she'd said she would be. The work took most of a cold day. Nobody made a ceremony of it. The posts went in at the new line. The old posts came out. The wire was restrung. At the end of it, Silas walked the new line from corner to corner while Willa walked beside him. The 11 feet of recovered ground was not dramatically different from the ground on either side of it, a strip of slope, some scrub grass, nothing remarkable in itself. But it was Mercer ground, and it was marked as Mercer ground now, and the men who put the posts in had done it right. At the corner stake, Silas stopped and looked at the line and then at Willa. What are you going to do with this section, he said. Nothing different than the rest, she said. It'll go into the rotation. He nodded. He was quiet for a moment, then said something she hadn't expected. I've been doing this wrong for a long time. Not just the fence, the whole orientation of it. Thinking the point was to hold as much as possible. He stopped. Your grandfather had 68 acres, and he spent 40 years figuring out what they could actually do. I've got 1,400, and I've 30 years spending them. She looked at him. Spending them how? Running them. Moving cattle on them. Taking from them without putting much back. He looked at the new fence line. My pastures are in worse shape than yours were when you came back, and I've never had to neglect them the way you were dealing with. They've just been run too hard for too long. She said carefully, Are you asking me something? He seemed to think about whether he was. I'm saying I've been watching what you've done with this ridge, and I think I'm doing some things wrong that I don't know how to fix. He paused. I'm not asking you to fix them. I'm just saying it out loud to someone I think understands what wrong looks like in this context. It was, she thought, possibly the most significant thing he'd said to her. More significant than the apology about the auction. The apology was about a moment. This was about a pattern, about a man in his 60s looking at the way he'd been doing something and naming it as wrong, which is considerably harder than apologizing for a single event. Rotational grazing, she said. That's where I'd start if I were looking at your situation. She paused. I could walk your south pastures with you sometime, if you wanted a second set of eyes. He looked at her. The expression was complex gratitude, layered over something like discomfort. The discomfort of a man accepting help from someone he'd underestimated. Appreciate that, he said. Not this week, she said. I've got too much running right now. After the first of the year. After the first of the year, he agreed. They walked back to the trucks in the late afternoon cold, the ridge above them, holding its particular silence, and Willa thought that this all of it, fence and the well and the access point and Silas walking beside her, asking about pasture management, was not what she'd planned when she'd come back here to take care of her grandmother. She hadn't planned anything, actually. She'd come back because someone needed her, and she was the one who could come. Everything else had grown out, everything else had planned that couldn't have been planned, because the ridge had its own logic and its own timeline, and all she'd done was pay attention to it. That was all Walter had done. Pay attention. For 40 years. And write down what he saw. She drove home in the early dark with the heater running, and the access log on the seat beside her, and the numbers in her head that she'd need to look at before bed flow rate, volume out, flock count, feed reserves, Mabel's physical therapy schedule, the winter agreement terms with Harlan and Boyd and June. The number of things she was holding simultaneously had grown so large that she'd begun keeping a separate management notebook for the farm operations, distinct from her observation journal, which she kept in the same format as Walter's ledger. She was on her third observation notebook now. She didn't think about what that meant, didn't frame it to herself as legacy or continuation. It was just what made sense. You watched the land and you wrote down what you saw. The farmhouse light was on when she pulled in. Mabel would be in the kitchen. There would be soup or something close to soup, because Mabel's definition of dinner had always been something hot in a pot, and her mobility limitations hadn't changed her definition of dinner. Elias's truck was still there, which meant he'd stayed late on something. She went to the barn first. He was in the main pen checking on a ewe that had been slightly off her feed for 2 days. He looked up when she came in. She ate this afternoon, he said. I think it was just the temperature change. She's been fine since about 3. Good. Willa looked at the ewe. The animal looked back at her with the particular indifference of a healthy sheep. You didn't need to stay. I wanted to be sure, he said. He closed the pen gate. How'd the fence go? It's done, she said. Properly. And Silas? She thought about what Silas had said at the corner stake, about spending 1,400 acres, about things being wrong for a long time. He's getting there, she said. Elias seemed to understand that was the whole answer. He picked up his jacket from the hook and said goodnight, and drove out, and Willa did one more pass through the pens and checked the north pasture gate and looked at the wellhead in the dark, the small light on the housing unit. Amos had installed glowed steadily, which was the only indication she needed that the pressure was holding, and then went inside. Mabel had made soup. She was standing at the stove with the cane hooked over the counter edge, stirring something that smelled like the kind of soup that had been building since afternoon. She didn't turn around when Willa came in. "Fence is done," she said. "Done and right," Willa said. "Good." Mabel kept stirring. Walter always said a right fence line is worth more than twice the money of a wrong one because a wrong one costs you twice when you have to fix it. Willa hung up her coat. He was right about most things. He was wrong about some, Mabel said, with the flat comfort of a woman who'd been married to a man for 40-some years and had the full accounting of his virtues and his failures. He was too slow to ask for help. He thought asking was losing something. "I know," Willa said. She sat at the table. "I had to learn the same thing." Mabel rolled soup into 2 bowls and brought them to the table with the careful economy of movement she'd developed since the walker. She sat down and looked at Willa across the table. "You're learning faster than he did," she said. "For what it's worth." "It's worth something," Willa said. "Don't let it make you impatient," Mabel said. "The learning faster is good. Being in a hurry because of it is how you get sloppy." Willa ate her soup. "You know, for someone who supported Walter's patience for 40 years, you give a lot of advice about not going too slow either." Mabel looked at her over the soup bowl with an expression that was not quite a smile, but was in the neighborhood. "I supported his patience with the ridge," she said. "I was considerably less patient with other things." She went back to her soup. "The land deserves patience. The paperwork does not." Willa almost laughed. It came out as a short exhale that was close enough. Kitchen was warm, and the soup was good, and outside the ridge sat in the November dark with 71 feet of cold water pressing steadily upward through limestone that had been there long before the Mercers and would be there long after, and above the wellhead the small indicator light glowed in the dark like the most ordinary, essential unheroic thing in the world, which it was. That was exactly what it was. The rain came in the 3rd week of January. And it came the way real rain comes after a long drought, not gently, not as a courtesy, but all at once and sideways. 3 days of it that turned the access road to mud and filled the creek beds and made the sheep huddle against the fence lines with their backs to the wind and their wool plastered flat against their sides. Willa stood at the barn door on the 2nd morning of it and watched the water come down and felt something release in her chest that she hadn't realized she'd been holding for months. Not relief. Exactly, relief was too simple a word for what drought actually feels like when you've been managing around it for 5 months. It was more like the end of a sustained effort, the moment when you've been holding a door closed against something heavy and the pressure finally comes off shoulder, and you can just stand there for a second breathing normally. The access log showed 412 total uses over the 5 months the point had been open. 37 distinct operations. Just under 18,000 gallons out, all accounted for, all logged. The well gauge had not dropped below its baseline once. She closed the log on the last day of January when the tanks and wells around the county had recovered enough that the morning line at the road had dwindled to nothing, and set it on the shelf next to Walter's ledger and her own observation notebooks, 4 of them now, and stood looking at that shelf for a moment before going to start the day's work. It was not a trophy. She didn't think of it that way. It was a record. The same thing Walter had been keeping for 40 years. The same impulse: write it down. Keep the count. Know what happened so you can understand what happens next. Elias found her at the wellhead that afternoon. The rain had stopped, finally, and the ridge was dripping and green in the way of early February thaw, everything wet and sharp smelling, the kind of day that makes you think of things starting even though it's still technically winter. He came up the north slope with his jacket open and mud on his boots and a piece of paper folded in his hand. "Something came in," he said. He handed her the paper. She unfolded it. It was a letter, actual paper, envelope, and letterhead from a land investment group based in the state capital. The language was careful and professional and took 3 paragraphs to say what could have been said in 1 sentence: they wanted to buy Briar Ridge. The offer was at the bottom, a number that Willa read twice and then looked away from and then looked at again. It was a serious number. It was the kind of number that 2.5 years ago would have solved every problem she had, and several she hadn't developed yet. She folded the letter and handed it back to Elias. "File it." He looked at her. "That's all?" "File it with the other 2, she said. He blinked. "There were 2 others? One in October, one in December," she said. "I didn't mention them because they weren't worth a conversation." He looked at the letter in his hand. This one's bigger than the October one. File it anyway. He was quiet for a moment. Can I ask why? Not arguing, I'm asking. She looked at the wellhead, at the gauge, that still showed the same steady pressure it had shown since Amos's drill broke through limestone at 71 feet. Because selling this property to a land investment group means the well becomes a resource extraction operation within 5 years. The aquifer gets pushed past its replenishment rate, the surface gets sold off in parcels, the cooperative agreements with Harlan and Boyd and June disappear, and everything that makes this ridge what it is right now gets converted into a number that looks good on one page and looks like a strip mine on the next. You know that for sure? I know what land investment groups do, she said. I spent 3 years in logistics. I've read enough purchase and development sequences to know the pattern. She picked up her clipboard. This property is worth more as a functioning piece of land than as a converted asset. That's not sentiment, that's accurate valuation. Elias nodded slowly. Okay, he said, file it, she said again. And the next one that comes, and the one after that, folded the letter back up. He was quiet for a moment, then said, you know people are going to think you're leaving money on the table. People thought I was crazy to buy 96 sheep, she said. I've stopped letting other people's financial math govern my decisions. He almost smiled at that. He went back down the slope, and she stayed at the wellhead for another moment, looking at the gauge, and then went to check the north fence line the way she did every day, because that was the work, and the work was what kept everything else standing. She walked Silas Crowder's south pastures the second Saturday of February, as she'd said she would after the first of the year. He met her at his gate at 8 in the morning with coffee in a thermos, and the expression of a man who has spent some time thinking about how to appear less uncomfortable than he actually is. They walked for 2 hours. His pastures were exactly what she'd expected from what he'd said at the fence line in November, overgrazed in the patterns that develop when cattle are rotated by convenience rather than by the recovery needs of the grass, compacted in the low areas where heavy animals have stood too long in wet conditions, thin in the sections that never fully rested between cycles. She said what she saw, directly, without softening it more than was useful. He listened without defending, which was harder for him than it looked, and she knew it. At the far end of the south section, he stopped at a fence line and looked over the rolling ground that had been his family's for 30 years. How long to bring this back? He said. Depends on how committed you are to the rotation, she said. If you do it right, 2 to 3 years for significant improvement. Probably 5 for the kind of recovery you're looking at in the low sections. She paused. It's the same timeline the Mercer land was on when I got here. Possibly better, because you haven't let it go as long. I have more cattle than you, he said. The rotation math is different. It is, she agreed. You'd need to split your herd into more groups than you're running now. Probably 4 sections minimum on the south pasture alone. It's more management overhead. He looked at the pasture. Will you help me set it up? She'd known the question was coming. She'd been thinking about it since November. I'll help you understand the system, she said. What you do with it is your operation. I'm not your manager. That's fair, he said. And I want something in return, she said. He looked at her. The county extension office has been talking about a land stewardship program for 3 years, and nothing's come of it because nobody with enough standing in the valley has pushed for it, she said. You have that standing. I'd like you to push for it. He was quiet. You want me to advocate for a program? I want you to be the person who makes it happen, she said. Because you can, and I can't. Not yet. I don't have the kind of history in this county that makes those meetings move. She met his eyes. You do. He looked at the pasture for a long moment. She could see him turning it over, not the logistics of it, which he'd be fine with, but the meaning of it. The fact that she was asking him to use his standing in service of an idea she'd developed on land she'd rebuilt, after 2 years of him being the loudest voice in the room against her. That's a very specific ask, he said. I'm a very specific person, she said. Something moved across his face, not quite amusement, not quite something more weighted. Yes, he said. You are. He turned and started walking back toward the gate. I'll make some calls. She walked beside him. The morning was cold and clear, and the ground under their feet was winter hard. And she thought about what Walter would have made of this walk, the Mercer woman and the Crowder man walking the Crowder land, talking about how to bring it back. She thought he would have found it entirely logical. She thought he would have said nothing about it and written it down that night in his ledger with the same small, cramped handwriting he used for everything. She decided to write it down in hers when she got home. March brought the lambing season, and lambing season on a flock the size Briar Ridge was now running was not a manageable background event. It was the main event. For 6 weeks, superseding almost everything else, in terms of time and attention and the particular vigilance that keeping newborn animals alive in variable weather required. They lost 4 lambs over the 6 weeks. 2 were early losses with complications that neither Willa nor Dr. Holt could have prevented. 1 was a night loss that Willa found in the morning and sat with for a few minutes longer than was strictly necessary before moving on to the next thing. 1 was a lamb she'd stayed up most of 2 nights with, working alongside Dr. Holt and Elias in shifts that simply didn't make it, despite everything they could do. She was not philosophical about that one. She was angry, briefly and privately, in the way of a person who has done everything right and had it not work anyway. Elias left her alone for an hour and then came and found her checking the ewes in the main pen and said, without preamble, 81 out of 85 is a good lambing rate for this size flock. I know, she said. I'm saying it anyway because you're doing the face. What face? The one where you're adding it to the ledger of things that didn't go right, he said, which is not the same ledger as things you did wrong. She looked at him. He was right, and she hated that he was right, because it was a distinction she knew intellectually and kept losing track of emotionally. Fine, she said. The 4 were losses, he said. The 81 are lambs. That's the actual math. Fine. I know. You also did the face again. She almost laughed. It came out wrong and ended up being a real laugh after all, which was probably what he'd intended, and she turned back to checking the ewes with the face presumably fixed. The 81 lambs were the largest single-season addition to the Mercer flock since Willa had come back to the ridge. The flock was now running at nearly 160 animals, which was approaching the carrying capacity of the available pasture under the rotational system, which meant decisions about expansion or strategic reduction were going to need to happen in the next 6 months. She'd already been thinking about it. The north extension, the 11 feet recovered from the fence survey, plus a larger section beyond it that Amos had looked at and said was suitable for light grazing, could add capacity without straining the existing pasture rotation. That was a possibility. A second option was to reduce the breeding stock and shift more animals toward production, which changed the economics and the timeline. She laid both options out for Gideon Pike when he came in April for the spring shearing. He sat at the kitchen table, same as always, with coffee he barely touched, and listened to her lay out the numbers. You're thinking like a larger operation than you're running, he said. I'm planning for the size I want to be running in 2 years, she said. That's not wrong, he said. Just make sure the 2-year plan doesn't strain the 1-year operation. He looked at the numbers she'd written out. The mill contract can absorb more volume if you can supply it. That's the cleanest path, grow the flock to the supply commitment rather than growing past it and creating surplus without a market. That's what I was leaning toward, she said. North extension, gradual flock increase, keep the ewe to ram ratio tighter. Gideon nodded. He looked at the notebook she'd been writing in her 4th, now nearly full. You know what that looks like, he said. I know, she said. Walter showed me his ledgers once, Gideon said. 19 years ago, maybe 20. I came out to look at some animals he was thinking of selling, and he showed me what he'd been keeping. He looked at her notebooks. Same system. She hadn't known that. The information settled into her the way certain things do quietly, without fanfare but with weight. Did he say why he kept them? She said. He said a farm you don't write down is a farm you're running on memory, Gideon said. And memory is the first thing to fail in a hard year. She looked at the notebooks. He was right. He was right about most things, Gideon said. Just needed someone to carry them forward. He stood up and picked up his hat. The shearing crew's coming Thursday. I've got a buyer interested in the spring clip if the fiber averages what last fall did. It should average higher, she said. The north pasture animals especially. Gideon looked at her. You've been feeding them different. Same feed, different rotation timing, more recovery time between grazes on that section. The grass is different there, more mineral content, I think, from the water influence. She paused. Walter noted it in his ledger 40 years ago. The north pasture plants grew differently than the rest. I think the aquifer proximity affects the soil chemistry. Gideon was quiet for a moment. You're going to have to write that up formally at some point, he said. Extension office would be interested. Silas is working on that, she said. Gideon raised an eyebrow. Silas Crowder. He's pushing the land stewardship program. It's actually moving now. She paused. People are full of surprises. Gideon put on his hat. Some of them, he said, and drove away. The morning Willa walked Mabel to the pasture gate was the second Saturday in April. She'd been building toward it since January, slowly, deliberately, the way Mabel did everything she decided to do, which was without drama and without the kind of announcement that creates performance pressure. They'd added distance in increments through February and March, walking the backyard, then the driveway, then the lane between the house and the first outbuilding. Mabel never asked when they were going to try the gate. Willa never offered a timeline. They both understood it was happening, and neither one needed to talk about when. The morning was clear and cold, in the particular way of April in hill country, cold enough to see your breath, warm enough in the direct sun that you could stand it without a heavy coat. The ground was firm and dry. Willa had checked the path to the gate the evening before, looking for anything uneven that she hadn't noticed before, any soft patch, anything that would make the walk harder than it needed to be. Mabel came out of the back door at 7:30 in her good coat, with the cane in her right hand and her left hand available. She didn't say anything. She stood on the back step for a moment, looking at the ridge and the morning, and then she looked at Willa. Willa offered her left arm. Mabel took it. They walked slowly. Not painfully slowly, Mabel had more strength in her than the doctors had predicted she'd recover, and considerably more stubbornness than anyone had ever questioned but carefully. With attention to each section of path, Willa, feeling the pressure of Mabel's hand on her arm and adjusting her pace without making it obvious that she was adjusting. It took them 12 minutes to reach the gate. Willa had walked it in 90 seconds 1,000 times and hadn't thought about what it was until she'd done it in 12 with Mabel beside her. Mabel stopped at the gate and looked out over the pasture. The flock was on the upper section visible from here, a spread of white and gray on the green hillside, the lambs distinguishable by their size and their tendency to run sideways, for no reason, which is something lambs do that seems to be purely for the pleasure of it. The ridge rose behind them, the north end, still carrying its particular darkness of old timber, the cleared sections showing green that had been brushed 2.5 years ago. Mabel was quiet for a long time. Willa stood beside her and did not say anything, because there was nothing to say. Some moments need to breathe. Finally, Mabel said very quietly, "He was right." "Yes," Willa said, "about all of it." Mabel's eyes were moving across the pasture. The ridge, the sheep, the water. The whole thing he spent his life being sure about, and nobody took seriously. She paused. He would have been so quiet about this. He would have stood here and looked at it and not said a single word. "I know," Willa said. "And then he would have gone and written it in his ledger," Mabel said. "I know." Mabel looked at the flock for another minute. One of the lambs on the upper sanctum section broke away from the group and ran sideways at high speed for 30 feet, and then stopped abruptly, as if surprised by its own momentum. Mabel watched this with an expression that was quietly something close to happiness. "Stubborn little things," she said. "Yes," Willa said so. "Him." She looked at Willa. "Like you." Willa held on to that and didn't answer, because some things said out loud at the right moment don't need a response, they just need to be received. They stood at the gate for another 10 minutes. Then Mabel said she was ready to go back, and they walked back the same way they'd come, slowly and carefully, and Willa felt the weight of her grandmother's hand on her arm and thought about all the things that were contained in that weight. 80 years of living on and around this land, 40 years of watching a man pay attention to it, 2 years of watching a granddaughter carry it forward, and she did not try to compress those things into a thought or a feeling or any particular conclusion. She just walked. Most of its windows were dark. The summer ran differently than any previous summer on the ridge, which was partly because the farm was operating at a different scale, and partly because the valley itself was different in ways that were subtle but real. The land stewardship program that Silas had advocated for, formally launched in June, with a meeting at the county extension office that 23 landowners attended, which was about 20 more than anyone had expected. Willa presented the Briar Ridge rotational grazing data at that meeting, not as a model to imitate, but as documentation of what a specific approach had produced on a specific piece of land over a specific period of time. She was careful about that distinction. What worked on 68 acres of Appalachian Ridge country with a limestone aquifer was not a universal prescription. It was a case, a well-documented case that other people could learn from while developing their own approaches to their own land. She'd been nervous before the meeting in a way she hadn't expected. She'd stood in front of larger groups in her logistics career and hadn't felt anything like this, but logistics presentations were about numbers she'd managed, not ground she'd worked with her hands and her body and her reserves. This was different. This was personal, in a way that professional is never quite personal. Silas introduced her. He did it simply, without overselling, which was exactly right. He said she'd turned a farm. Everyone had written off into the most productive operation in the corridor and had probably kept 6 or 7 neighboring operations from serious livestock losses during the drought, and that the program they were launching owed its existence significantly paints to what she demonstrated was possible. Then he sat down and let her speak. She spoke for 40 minutes. She showed Walter's maps alongside her own. She showed the before photographs and the current photographs. She showed the well data and the flow rates and the access log numbers from the drought period. She showed the wool quality progression season over season. She showed Dana Cho's restaurant orders and Gideon's mill contract figures. She showed the flock numbers from 90 thin animals to 160 healthy ones. She did not make it into a story about herself. She made it a story about the land and what it was capable of when you paid attention to what it needed instead of forcing it into what you needed from it. At the end, a woman in the back row named Patricia, who farmed 40 acres on the north side of the valley and whom Willa had never spoken to directly, raised her hand and said, "How long did it take before you trusted what you were seeing? Before you stopped second-guessing your own observations?" Willa thought about that honestly, which took a moment. "I'm not sure I've stopped," she said. "I think I've gotten more comfortable with uncertainty. I used to want to be sure before I acted. Now I act on the best information I have, and I write down what happens so I can be more accurate next time." She paused. "My grandfather spent 40 years observing this land before he was certain enough to write, 'Leave it alone until there's a reason to open it.' I don't think that was hesitation. I think that was honesty about what he knew and what he didn't." Patricia nodded slowly. "That's not what they taught us," she said. "They taught us to project confidence." "I know," Willa said. "I think that's a significant part of why we've got so much degraded farmland in this county." There was a silence in the room that was not uncomfortable. The silence of people thinking about something that had been said that they hadn't thought quite that way before. Then the conversation opened up and ran for another hour and a half, and Willa sat in the middle of it and answered what she could and said she didn't know when she didn't. And the meeting ended with the kind of specific energy that means something is actually going to happen, rather than the other kind. That means people felt good for an afternoon. Silas caught her at the door on the way out. "Good meeting," he said. "Good room," she said. He looked at her. "You know you're the person who's going to end up running this program in 2 years." "I know," she said. "I'm not ready for that yet." "I know you're not," he said. "I said 2 years." She looked at him. He was smiling in the way of a man who has decided to be on the right side of something and is finding it more satisfying than he'd anticipated. "Get your south pastures in order first," she said. "Working on it," he said, and held the door for her, and she walked out into the June evening without making a thing of the door holding, because some shifts in how people treat you are better received simply than analyzed. Gideon Pike retired from active shearing in July. He was 69, and his back had been telling him something for 3 seasons that he'd been polite not listening to. And in July, he listened. He called Willa and told her, directly, the way he told her everything, and said he'd be transitioning the mill relationships and the broker arrangements to her over the summer. "To me," she said. "You know the operations involved," he said. "You know the mills. You know what your fiber is worth. You don't need a broker anymore. You need a contact list and the confidence to use it without someone in the middle." "Confidence I have," she said. "The contact list would be helpful. You'll have it by end of August," he said. "I'll make the introductions myself." "Gideon," she said. She stopped. She was not good at this kind of thing, at acknowledging what someone has done for you in a way that doesn't feel either underdone or overdone. She was working on it. Don't, he said, not unkindly. Just keep doing what you're doing. That's the acknowledgement I want. All right, she said. He came out one last time in August, officially, to finalize the contact transfers and walk the flock. He spent an hour with the sheep, not examining them for sale, just walking among them in the way of a man who has spent 40 years around these animals and finds their company, he would never say comfortable, but close to it. Willa walked with him, and they talked about the flock's development and the fiber quality and the lamb rates. And at the end of it, Gideon stopped at the north fence line and looked out over the section where the sheep had first clustered at the cold stretch of creek 2 summers ago. He would have been glad to know you found it, Gideon said. He was not looking at her. She looked at the fence line. The flock had spread across the north section in the late afternoon light, grazing slowly. The animals graze when they're full, and the grass is good, and the day is coming down easy. I think he knew someone would, she said. I think that's why he wrote it down. Gideon looked at the sheep for another moment. Then he said, I've brokered wool from 40-some farms over my career. Every one of them had something they thought made them specific. A breed, a pasture, a method. He paused. This place is the only one I've seen where what made it specific was the person running it understanding what the land already was, instead of trying to make it into something else. She looked at him. He was not a man who said things like this, and the rarity of it made it land with more weight than it would have from someone else. Walter made that argument for 40 years, she said. And you proved it, Gideon said. He picked up his hat. For whatever it's worth from an old man who didn't say it soon enough, you've done something here worth doing. He walked back to his truck, and she walked beside him, and at the truck he shook her hand the way he always had, firmly and without ceremony, and drove down the lane and out through the gate. She watched him go. Then she looked back at the ridge. The light was going long and gold, the way it does in August over hill country, and the flock was still moving slowly across the north section, and the well gauge at the head of the slope showed the same steady number it always showed, and the ledgers were in the farmhouse on the shelf, Walter's first, then hers, 4 of them now, each page evidence of someone paying attention, and somewhere in the house Mabel was probably doing something she'd been told not to do yet, and doing it anyway. She thought about what Gideon had said, about understanding what the land already was. She thought about the auction barn and the sound of laughter moving through a room. She thought about $462 and 90 thin sheep and a drive home with the truck, smelling like lanolin, and something she hadn't been able to name at the time. She knew what it was now. It was the particular smell of a decision you can't take back, which is not always terror and is sometimes, if you've read the situation right and done the work, honestly, just the smell of where you're supposed to be. She went back to the farmhouse. She checked on Mabel, who was, predictably, attempting to reorganize the pantry from a seated position in a way that technically complied with her mobility restrictions while violating their spirit. Willa helped her finish and did not comment on the spirit violation. She made dinner. She sat at the kitchen table with the ledger open to a fresh page and wrote down the day's observations, the flock distribution, the well numbers, Gideon's last visit, the things she'd noticed about the north section grass that she wanted to track through the fall. She wrote, "The land doesn't change on your schedule. You change on its. The only question is whether you're paying close enough attention to know what it's asking." She didn't know if that was original or if she'd absorbed it from Walter's ledger in some form. At this point, the distinction felt less important than the fact of writing it down. The writing down was the thing. The writing down was how you took something you'd learned the hard way and made it available to whatever came next. Outside, the ridge settled into the August dusk. The sheep were coming down from the north section of the slow drift. That means they've decided the day is done. The well indicator showed steady in the failing light. The creek on the north end ran cold the way it always had. From below, from limestone, from the source Walter had spent 40 years watching, and Willa had spent 2 years learning to trust. Mabel came and sat at the table beside her. She didn't ask what Willa was writing. She picked up her own cup of tea and looked out the kitchen window at the last of the light on the ridge. "He would have loved this summer," Mabel said. "I know," Willa said. "He would have sat right there and said very little and loved all of it." I know, Willa said again. Mabel looked at the ledger. You're going to fill that one by October. Probably, Willa said. I'll need a fifth. Mabel looked at the shelf where the ledgers stood. Walter's and then Willa's 4. We're going to need a bigger shelf, she said. Willa looked at the shelf, then at Mabel. The older woman's eyes were clear and steady in the kitchen light, 80 years old and still entirely present. And there was something in her expression that was not just peace, but the specific satisfaction of a woman who had watched the long arc of a thing she believed in finally land where it was always going. I'll build one, Willa said. Mabel nodded. Build it wide, she said. You've got a long way to go yet. The kitchen held them both in its particular quiet. The ridge outside was dark now, and the sheep were in the barn, and the water was moving 60 feet below the limestone, as it always had and always would. And the county that had laughed at a young woman buying dying sheep at an auction in February was 3 years into, depending on what that young woman had found beneath the ground, she'd refused to give up on. None of it had been clean. None of it had been easy or certain or arrived in the order she'd expected. She'd made mistakes that cost her. She'd had days when the math didn't work, and the animals were sick and the weather was wrong, and she was too tired to think clearly, and she'd done it anyway because the alternative was stopping, and stopping was not something Walter Mercer's some granddaughter was built for. What she'd built was not a monument. It was a farm. A working, breathing, demanding, occasionally infuriating 68 acres of Appalachian hill country that required her full attention and returned that attention in kind, in grass and water and wool and the particular quality of early morning on a ridge that everyone had called worthless, until someone took the time to understand what worthless actually meant. It meant not yet. It meant waiting for the person patient enough to listen. The ridge had been waiting a long time. Willa Mercer had been the person it was waiting for, and she was still here, and she intended to stay. She turned to the next page in the ledger and kept writing.